Are you an early stage founder revolutionizing the future of retail? Then you're in the right place. My name is Sapna Shah, and I'm an angel investor investing at the pre-seed stage in retail tech, e-commerce, and digitally native brands. I'm also the founder of Retail X Series, an in-real-life event series based in New York to help early-stage founders think through topics like customer acquisition, sales pipelines, branding, financial modeling, fundraising, and more. In this podcast, I interview founders and investors who've spoken at Retail X Series events in the past, and we dig deep into the tactics around key topics that early-stage founders want to hear about. Welcome to the Retail X podcast. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Retail X Series podcast. I'm your host, Sapna Shah. Today's episode is all about building your brand for DTC companies. Our guest today is Carolyn Rush, formerly of Warren Agency and now head of brand and strategy at Robyn. Carolyn will give her take on best practices for building a DTC brand from the early days. Welcome to the podcast, Carolyn.
Thanks, Sapna. Thanks so much for having me. So good to be here.
I'm so excited to have this chat. So let's start with some background. Tell us a little bit more about you and your background and what you're currently doing at Robyn.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you said, most recently, when I was with you at the live Retail X, I was a partner at Warren, which was a creative agency building brands for women. And so, since 2014, I was doing that. I was building brands and global campaigns, all in the name of radically reshaping the way women are thought about, talked about, and represented. And then during my time at Warren, I became super interested in the birth space randomly. I mean, I was, overseeing everything from periods to menopause and everything that affects women in between, and got really, really kind of focused on women's health personally. So I became a birth and postpartum doula for fun. And that really opened my eyes to this entire world, which is enter the Robyn experience where I am now. So I'm currently the head of brand and strategy at Robyn, which, if anyone doesn't know, it's the leading brand and marketplace for what we're calling aspiring, expecting, and new parents. And so it's this rapidly growing community-driven platform that provides access to integrative maternal wellness tools and materials. And our official product is launching in July, where we're going to have a marketplace of providers that all specialize in maternal wellness. So that is what I'm working on.
And I guess this is where I should probably mention that I'm also an investor in Robyn, so I'm doubly excited to have you here on the podcast, Carolyn.
So it is like such full circle, because when I met you, I was not working at Robyn and didn't know that you were an investor in Robyn, and here I am. So it's pretty cool.
Worlds colliding.
Yes.
All right. So let's start talking about branding. Let's start with your perspective on kind of what even is a brand. So at the earliest stages of a startup, a lot of the founders in this Retail X community, when they're starting their company, they want to know like what really is a brand in those early days. Is it like a logo, some graphics, some font, and a tagline, maybe just some pretty pictures on Instagram? Like, how do you really define what branding is in those early days?
Yeah, I love that question. I think in the early stages of a company, a brand really means just having a solid idea of what you're building and why you're building it and who you're building it for. And which in turn is really brand positioning and strategy. So I always say, it's really easy. Of course, in today's world, you're going to need to have a presence. Even when you're building a brand that you haven't raised for and that you're planning on raising for, you're going to need to start getting information and posting things out there for sure. But I wouldn't I wouldn't spend all my time worrying about what the visuals look like from day one. I would more focus on the strategy, the positioning. What really are you building and who are you building it for? There's so many pillars of things you can kind of create foundationally, like your values and just understanding more about why you're building this thing and who you're building it for. Those are the critical things that need to come before you make the decisions around the visual identity, is what I call it. So for me, there's the work that comes first is research. And then next is the brand positioning and the brand strategy. And then only once you have those things, whether it's a lot or a little of both of those things, can you build the brand, which is split up into two. In my world, it's visual and verbal identity. And those two things kind of make up the brand, but not without that first kind of core work. So I think you can do that you can always do any of that at a small scale. It can look like calling up your friends and asking their opinions on things. That can be your research in the early days. I don't think we need to conflate it to be something, where you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, which I know we're going to talk about throughout this whole podcast. But yeah, so that would be my kind of early stage answer.
So I think that's really helpful. And I think there is a lot that we can talk about more about kind of how do you think about those things in terms of
Mm-hmm.
doing the research and coming up with what your positioning is. But before we get into that, I also want to talk about what the difference is between branding and marketing. I feel like in the early days, those get very conflated by founders. And I think that really keeping them separate in your mind could be very helpful from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. They have to be separate in your mind. I think this is I'm glad you asked this, and it's so important. And so many times when people would come, wanting to work with us, they would kind of think we were a digital marketing agency. And it's so hard when all the terms are thrown around. So give yourself some credit. It's okay if this isn't totally clear. But the way I've said it before is that a brand is your point of view, and marketing is like the extroverted cousin. That's how you sell it. And so they are wildly different though. And brand is concrete, and marketing comes in all different flavors, right? So there's performance marketing, there's social media, digital marketing, there's out of home marketing, there's influencer partnership marketing. Those are just like 4 examples of a million. And branding has to come first. So you can't market something that you don't have a brand for. I mean, you can, it's just probably not going to work very well. When you are going through marketing, all the things that you're doing, like A/B testing, language and creative, like if you don't have language or creative, what are you A/B testing? So that's the difference there. And honestly, there's usually a divide when it comes to partners, brand partners and marketing partners. I'm sure there's a couple of agencies, that do both and have kind of 2 huge teams that and do it well. But I would say typically it's brand team that are solely focused on strategy, and then visual and verbal identity, like I said, and then there's marketing teams of all kinds that usually even have different agencies for their own specific flavor of marketing. I hope that answers it.
Yeah, I think that was actually really helpful. So, and I love your quote about kind of brand as your point of view and marketing is its extroverted cousin. I love that. I think that might be the title of this episode. So now that we kind of have that sort of framework in our heads, let's go back to what you were saying about sort of the research, positioning, and strategy as sort of the kind of first steps you do before you get into visual and verbal identity. Can you walk us through, like, if you were a startup starting today, how would you do that research? How would you think about answering questions on the positioning and the strategy of your brand before you get to the identity parts?
I think in the early days is when you're freshest anyway. And I mean that in a good way. At a certain point, you're going to need a partner, whether it's a buddy that you call or that doesn't work at your company, or someone that you hire because you are just too close to it. But I think in the early days, it's when you're most energized about this new thing that you're doing. And so I would encourage you to just do some baseline research, qualitative, quantitative, whether it be phone calls or SurveyMonkey or Google surveys, things like that, to really get some data. I find that when you have data, even if it's literally a Google survey that 100 people filled out, it gives you something to stand on to start building, the language around your brand. And so I always encourage people, especially if they can't hire anyone, just to start doing some Google surveys and get some questions answered that you have hunches about. I think that's the perfect first step. One of the questions that we talked about earlier, Sapna, was just like, when does a name come in? What comes first? And like I said, it was like the research, the strategy, and then the visual and verbal identity. But if you're going to raise, you need something, right? You need to have a project name at least. And so I usually see people put together a baseline brand that they go and raise initial funding with, even if it's friends and family, and then they end up changing it completely. And that's totally fine. Like the first thing you put as your name of your company does not have to be what it is for the rest of its entire lifetime.
Yeah, I believe that was the case with Robyn as well.
Yes, it was. It was. So the Robyn, the company I'm working at now, I met Allie, the founder, about 5 years ago, and she had named the company Fertile Girl. it was a nutrition bar company at that point in time. And it was born out of her own experience having trouble getting pregnant. And we helped her completely rename and rebrand. She completely changed her business model. She realized, she woke up one day and was like, I don't want to run a food business, even though this was working. And so, yeah, we absolutely were like, let's change. So like I said, it usually comes at a pivotal point, and Sapna can speak to that as she's the expert too with funding, and that pivotal point is almost always funding.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. But I think that's a great example of, as a founder, you might not be an expert in branding. You're certainly probably not an expert in naming. And you kind of come up with something that's generally pretty on the nose and pretty literal. And then, over time, with that pivotal point of funding, or as you get to maybe even know your business better and understand what it is, you do have this ability to continue to evolve the brand and maybe even completely turn it on its head, as was the case with Robyn.
Exactly. And being open to that, there comes a point usually where the founder, they might be connected to that name. And to be honest, like, there's always going to be someone that says, well, I liked your old name better. It's just the way it is. But for the most part, you got to do what's right for your brand. And especially like if investors are kind of nodding their head and saying that works better, then it probably is working better.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a really good point too. And maybe we should talk about that, is that at those early days, you don't necessarily have a good sense of who your customer is, right? You might have some early customers. You don't know if they're really just your friends and family and your network that are maybe your customers. You don't really fully have a full picture of all the customer personas that you might be going after. So what do you do from a branding perspective when you don't have some of that information? I mean, you talked a little bit about research. You also mentioned the word kind of going with your hunches. How would you kind of maybe think about adjusting those hunches, or what other sorts of kind of customer information would you want to see that might help evolve the brand at the earliest days?
Such a good question. In terms of hunches can create your questions that you ask people and then derive data from those answers, right? Like, that's kind of how I think about the hunch. And you're absolutely 100% right. I would say like 9 times out of 10, your early customers, early days, are your friends and family. And this isn't an accurate picture of who your actual customer is going to be. And so what we would usually do at Warren is create those customer personas for and with the entrepreneur or the founder, and then do potential customer interviews of people that, fit that persona, but aren't yet a customer, so that we could understand, some of their buying habits, some of their intuitions, their feedback, their thoughts on different language. I think that information is more helpful than you might realize, because you're totally right. I mean, I would say like early days, 90% of your quote unquote customer base is like people within your circle, or like, twice third removed.
Yeah, that's a really good kind of technique. I love the idea of like trying to get out of that bubble of your friends and family in the beginning, because I do think you might go one direction, honestly, not just with branding, but with your entire company. If you hear feedback from friends and family, which generally tends to be nicer maybe than feedback from strangers.
Right. That's exactly right. It almost always is. Right. And then you're not getting a good picture of what you should be doing. You need that critical feedback. Unfortunately, it's not fun, but it is what helps you build a better product usually.
Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned kind of what you used to do at Warren in this case, but do early stage startups kind of that have not raised their pre-seed, maybe they've raised some friends and family or bootstrapping, very similar to the founders kind of in the Retail X community. Do you need to hire a branding firm right from the beginning? Do you wait? I mean, we hear like these crazy prices of hundreds of thousands of dollars to do branding, which obviously no one can afford before they've raised any money. But should you even like maybe hire a freelancer or somebody, if this is not your forte as a skill set that you have as a founder? Should you hire somebody, or can you do this on your own?
Here's the thing. Funds do affect being able to work with an agency. And I do want to break down and demystify all the different ways that you can work with an agency or even a smaller shop than what even would be considered a quote unquote agency. There's a 2-person design shop that maybe they're 2 designers that came from a bigger agency like a Droga or a Red Antler, and now they're doing their own kind of consulting thing, and maybe it's only $15,000 tops to work with them to build your whole brand, and they're going to do a great job, and then there's the 10-person agencies, there's 100-person agencies. It's a wild world out there. And so my first suggestion would be, if you can find a friend or someone that knows that space that can kind of help you so that you're not walking into it blind. The one thing, it can A, take a long time to find the right partner, and B, you don't want to waste money you don't have at any point in your business, right? Like not having the amount of funds or having the amount of funds. You don't want to waste your time or your money. And if you don't have a friend, like maybe cold LinkedIn message someone that looks like would be smart and that you admire based on their background, and say, hey, here's what I'm looking to do. The likelihood that if they don't respond, they don't respond. But if you don't have someone in that space, get someone in that space is, I guess, what I'm saying initially. And yeah, I would just say, like, when finding the right partner, whether it's one person that's contract or an agency, just make sure that you like hanging out with them, right? And like you trust them, and that the expectations are completely aligned. I think, it's kind of, I'm like bleeding into different topics here, but I think it's important to, to just, if you are going to hire, I guess before you raise, you're not going to work with a big agency. Let's just put it right there. You, like 99% of the time, you're not. If you have $20,000 to run your company, do not hire an agency that costs $20,000, right? Like that would be a bad decision. After you raise $1 million in your pre-seed, and you want to spend 20 grand on an agency to build your brand for real, maybe up to 50 grand. That's a more accurate way to think about spending. But a lot of times in the early days, people would have a certain, chunk of cash from their accelerator, and they would spend it all on branding. And then they didn't spend any on their product. And then it has to go both ways. Always, always, always. You have to be continually building both sides of the business. And I know that's probably obvious, and you're like, duh, Carolyn, but
no, I think that's a really good point, because I do think, a lot of founders who come to me and ask me if they really need to do a lot more branding work, and they might not be that great at branding, and they might not really have a good sense of what even like who their customer is going to be. And they're like, maybe I need to hire an agency. And I'm like, how much money do you have? Because it's expensive. And if you can't afford that in the early days, which, most founders can't, I think it's really challenging for founders to say, okay, I'm competing against these other founders who maybe have raised some money, who have like this sort of beautiful visual identity, a brand that completely makes sense. All of it looks good. It's part of their packaging. They understand their customer. And here I am, like trying to really scrappily build my own. And I think the knee-jerk reaction is, any money I have, maybe I need to put it into this, or maybe I need to put it into Facebook ads, right? Like it's one or the other.
Yeah. In this world, it is. It's true. I mean, the thing is, if you work with a really skilled freelancer, you can get a lot done. If you work with a really, really talented designer, to be able to make that work though, you have to carve out the time, and you have to already have the vision of what you want to do, or at least like the strategic point of view. And like, you got to be in it and leading that project with and for them. I've seen it work really well. I just did a freelance project being that strategic lead for my brother-in-law's new upcycled cracker company, and hired, a designer duo, and it went so smoothly. Like, it is possible. I just want to confirm and affirm that. And I think the kind of big meaty piece of it for me is that you as a founder are 100% too close to it to see the opportunity that usually you could do with your brand. You need someone to come in and just ask you questions, and from your answers help you build that vision. So That's kind of how I see it. Even if it's just a friend.
Yeah, yeah. And I know when we spoke in the live event of RetailX last year, we talked about a really inexpensive way to get started on those questions and a questionnaire that you had mentioned. Could you talk a little bit about that questionnaire, and perhaps we can link
Sure.
the show notes here so that people can access it?
Absolutely. I'd be happy to. I send around this questionnaire all the time. And basically it kind of starts this. If you have this questionnaire and you literally go through this with someone who might be in the industry that you trust, I think it's an amazing exercise to start if you have $0. So, it's really going through, like, at the end of the day, if you can answer these questions, why does this product need to exist and why now? If you can look at yourself in the mirror and answer those questions energetically with confidence, that is so much more important than anything else, right? Like that is the most important prerequisite of working with anyone on your brand. It's going to make everything so much easier. There's tons of questions like, list 10 words that represent what you want people to think your brand is. What are 10 words that are the opposite of what you think your brand is? How do you want people to feel when they see or hear something about your company? If you kind of get to those emotions, if you literally get down to the sensorial feelings of how someone feels, it makes it more special, especially if you're selling something like a razor, which, like, it can be hard. You're like, where do I start to make this? You have to build a world, and that's what building a brand is. You have to build this world that people are living in and experiencing through your product. And it's not just about features and function. Maybe that is your brand. Maybe your brand is features and function, and then that's great. Then that's, you can roll with that. But most of the time you're building a world, and you have to get down to the emotional experience to build a world.
I mean, what it sounds like is all these questions that you're asking yourself. This isn't like sit down and jot something down and in 15 minutes you're done. These are kind of thought-provoking exercises that might take a really long time for you to figure out, particularly in your razor example, right? Like, how do you put emotion into certain products? It feels like this is more of a journey and not just let me fill out a form.
It 100% is. And that's why it's, I always wanted to make sure that whoever I was working with was ready for that journey, was ready to go on that. That's kind of loosey-goosey, but it is like therapy. It can be. And it's really productive, fun therapy. Let me say it that way. It's like, one done right, if you have the mental headspace to go through this, then it's going to be great. But if it can be really hard. I empathize with founders. It's like you're running P&Ls and dealing with manufacturers, and then you're having to talk about the emotional aspect of the world that you're building around a razor. Like it's hard to switch that part of your brain. I totally get it. But it's like, you do have to force yourself into that. And maybe it's on a weekend and you can chill out that day and, just have a whole day where you're kind of doing a little workshop. Awesome. Whatever works for you.
Yeah. I really like sort of this idea of spending the time to do this if you have to make the time. But I think the thing that a lot of what we've been talking about is kind of what we've focused on here is like the customer, sort of the external communication of your product, service, and what it means. But at the same time as you're doing these things and thinking kind of externally, because you're going to sell this product to people, should you also be kind of building the brand into the culture of your company right from the beginning? Like, how do you think about brand being more, not just externally focused, but also something that you live with every day internally?
Absolutely. Let's talk about this for a minute. So, well, first of all, yes, but like, don't go crazy with it. Like, you don't your life doesn't have to be your company's brand. You don't have to completely change who you are. If you have to completely change who you are, something's off, right? But let's go back to, I do think that this is why positioning and brand strategy, that foundation is so important. Because usually in that moment, you're building things like brand values. Let's say your brand values are like integrity and being in communication and consistency. If that's what your brand values are as a brand, with how you're acting with your customer, it's going to make living out those values for your customers a lot easier if you're living those out with your employees. Absolutely building it into the fabric of your culture. It doesn't have to look like all day, every day, that's what you're thinking about. And you get these values in neon lights and you put them in the front door of your office. Like it doesn't have to be that, I think like, look, you are an entrepreneur. This is your company. These are your chances to do things differently, which is the really exciting, like starry eye part of this whole journey, like you get to do things differently. For example, like if you're passionate about equal rights and justice for women, and that's a core pillar of your brand, like sit down with a buddy who is good at HR and say, I want to build a really smart parental leave policy. Like I want to do it so that I can still afford to stay in business, but like I want to make that a priority. Like I want that to be a part of our culture, and I want that to be something that people are attracted to work here because of that. Those are our values. Let's live it. So it can come in all different. It doesn't have to be how you send every Slack message is like rooted in your brand. It can be just more intentional. I would say like pick a couple things and be really intentional about them, and don't like freak yourself out every day, all day.
I think that's really good advice. And I think being intentional is probably the right way of putting it. And then also not freaking yourself out. Also very good.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay. So I want to kind of end with we've talked a lot about a lot of different things here. We've talked a lot about process, what is a brand, but if you could give early stage founders kind of one piece of advice as they think about building their brands right from the beginning, what would that be?
Make your brand the fun part of running your company, I guess is what I would say. Just have fun with it. Work with smart people who you have fun with and that you trust and you just want to be around, and just build it when it feels right. This is your company. Like I just want to keep going back to that. Like it can feel so confusing about when's the right time, how much money do I spend, who do I work with? Like you started this company from nothing. Like go with your gut and work with smart, fun people and like have a blast with this part. It can be really fun if you approach it that way, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, I love that. And if it's not fun, maybe there's something wrong, to your earlier point.
Yeah, there might be. It should be fun.
Well, that's the perfect note to leave this on. So, Carolyn, thank you so much for sharing your advice and tips on this podcast. I very much appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a blast.
And thank you for listening to the Retail X podcast. We'll have another new episode out shortly.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to attend a Retail X Series event in person, check out www.retailxseries.com for upcoming events in New York. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram @RetailXSeries. You can also learn more about me, find fundraising resources, or submit a pitch deck at www.redgiraffeadvisors.com. Thanks, and catch you next time.